I should have known better. It wasn't supposed to happen. But when you spend enough time with someone, feelings blur, and lines you never intended to cross are crossed. This is exactly what happened in my case with one of my patients. You never think that this will happen to you. As a nurse, you always remain professional. The boundaries are there for a reason, aren't they? But life doesn't always pay attention to your limits. This is the story of how something so small got out of control. Contract: I am not proud of what happened, and yet I still find myself wondering how he got here. But maybe you will understand. Maybe you'll understand it after listening to this. You'll understand why it all started innocently enough, like most things. I was only doing my job. He came for a treatment, something routine. He looked polite, a little reserved, but quite friendly, nothing fancy, at least, not at first. I had seen dozens of patients like him, without any red flags, nothing that could have suggested anything. But then, during his treatment, things started to change. You see, we saw each other all the time, and that's how it goes when you're a nurse. You are often with your patients more than you think. You get to know them on a personal level. And over time, something started to change. It wasn't immediate. We talked more, shared little stories, and laughed at things that had nothing to do with his treatment. It was a conversation, wasn't it? It was harmless. But that's where I made a mistake. I didn't realize that with every conversation, every laugh, I was with each step deeper and deeper into dangerous territory, and by the time I realized it, it was already too late. Honestly, I really don't know when the dynamic changed. Maybe it was when he complimented me at my bedside, telling me that no one had ever made him feel so comfortable during his treatment. Or maybe it was the way her eyes lingered on mine a little longer than necessary after one of our sessions. But suddenly the air between us was different, charged. It didn't take long for the lines between nurse and patient to begin to blur. One day, I remember the exact moment our hands touched as he moved his foredrip. It was as if the feeling of her skin against mine had been etched into my memory. This feeling should have faded more quickly. It should have remained professional, but I didn't. Neither does he. We let this moment float in the air, thick with tension that none of us wanted to acknowledge. I told myself that it didn't mean anything. We were just human, weren't we? People log in at any time, and this was just one of those moments. I told myself that it was harmless, that I could keep things under control, but deep down, I knew better than I did. I just didn't want to admit it. Then, he started to stay after his sessions ended. He stayed and spoke when there was nothing significant to discuss. He would ask me about my day, my life away from the clinic, all these things that had nothing to do with his treatment. And I found myself telling him things that I probably shouldn't have. I felt like I could trust him, that he understood me in a way that no one else understood. And that's when I really started to lose control. I thought I could handle it. I thought that as long as I kept my feelings under control, nothing would happen. But as the days became more and more unmanageable to ignore him, it was in the way he looked at me, in the way he waited until everyone was gone before starting a conversation. It was subtle at first, but it became more obvious. Over time, he was no longer just a patient. There was something else, something unspoken but undeniable, hovering between us, and I didn't know how to stop it. There was one day in particular when this stands out. It was nothing fancy, just another session like the ones we'd had before, but this time, as I was finishing, he looked at me differently. I could feel the tension in the room, thick and almost suffocating. He didn't say anything at first, he just looked at me, his eyes following my every move. It was unsettling, but fascinating. I hate to admit it now, but it's the truth. There was something that made my heart beat faster, something that made me want to linger a little longer. I kept telling myself, go away, end the conversation like I had done every time. Instead, I stayed. I let him continue to talk to me, to ask me questions about my life, my family, my thoughts, things that had absolutely nothing to do with his treatment, and I answered him. I let my guard down in a way I knew I shouldn't. It was a dangerous game, in which I was starting to lose control. As the weeks passed, our conversations became personal. We started sharing things we never had. He talked about his life, his struggles, his frustrations, while I told him things that I hadn't told anyone and that maybe I shouldn't have shared with a patient, but it felt good to talk to him, to be understood. There was a connection between us that I couldn't deny, even though I knew how bad it was. One day, after one of his treatments, he stayed behind. This time, there was no one else. It was just the two of us in the silent room, and I could feel the tension rising. He didn't say anything at first, he just looked at me like he expected something to happen. I should have left. Knowing full well that instead I was standing there frozen, waiting for his first move. And when it happened, something broke. He took a step closer, his eyes fell on mine, and my heart skipped a beat. He leaned over, reached out, and the casual brushing of his hand against mine caused all the boundaries I had set between us to collapse. I don't know what I expected at the time, but not this. Our hands that touched each other at that moment sent an electrical wave through me, as if all the nerves in my body were in a state of alert. Time seemed to slow down, and for a brief second, it was just the two of us standing there, connected in a way that transcended words. I could have walked away, I could have stopped him before he went any further, but I didn't. Instead, I froze, letting the moment drag on longer than it should have. My mind was racing, torn between what I knew was right and what my heart was telling me. And then, just like that, it was over. He withdrew his hand, and the spell was broken. The tension in the room has not disappeared, however. On the contrary, it has become thicker, more intense. He didn't say anything, and neither did I. We both stood there, both knowing exactly what had just happened, both pretending that it wasn't. I wanted to tell him that we couldn't go on like this, that things had gone too far, but that the words weren't coming out. Instead, I gave him that faint smile and told him I'd see him on his next date. I finally thought that would be the end, that we would both get back to normal, but of course, we didn't. Things only got worse from there. The next time he walked in, the atmosphere was different. We no longer spoke so much. We no longer shared that facility of conversation to which we had become so accustomed. Instead, there was an awkwardness between us, as if we both knew something had changed but didn't want to admit it. I could feel the tension building every time we were in the same room, and it drove me crazy. I couldn't stop thinking about him. I couldn't help but wonder what would happen if we crossed that line again. It didn't take long for the situation to reach its climax. One day after, in a particularly tense session, he asked if we could speak privately. I hesitated, knowing where it was going to go, but I agreed. We walked into an empty room, away from the prying eyes of other staff members, and that's when he finally said it. He told me he couldn't stop thinking about me, that he had feelings for me that went far beyond those of a nurse-patient relationship. I stood there speechless, my mind racing with 1,000 different thoughts. I knew it was wrong. I knew I had to stop it immediately, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I found myself telling her that I felt the same way. The words came out before I could stop them, and once they came out, there was no way to take them back. We both stood there looking at each other, the weight of what we had just confessed weighing heavily in the air. I didn't know what to do next. I didn't know how to fix this, or even if it could be fixed. All I knew was that we had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. After this admission, things changed between us, not in the way I would have liked. The tension that had been, the shudder between us bubbled up at each look, at each contact. It was no longer a flirtation. It was something deeper, much more complicated, and I didn't know how to deal with it. The worst part is that I wanted to see him more often. I was looking forward to his appointments, which I knew would be bad. I tried to convince myself that I could stay professional, that nothing more would happen, but deep down, I knew that was not true. One day, after what seemed to be the longest session to date, he was left behind again. I could see it was in her eyes. He wasn't there just to get treatment, but for something else he didn't say. I didn't know how to stop him. I didn't know how to stop. Just as the last patient had left and the clinic had calmed down, he approached me. His eyes were overflowing with things left unsaid. We were standing too close, the kind of closeness that feels dangerous, like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing that one wrong move could tip you over. Before I could utter a word, he leaned over, his warm breath against my skin, and at that moment, every part of me was screaming that it was wrong. I didn't back down. He whispered that he couldn't stop thinking about me, that it had gone too far, but he didn't know how to stop. And in that second, I was the same, under the influence of something that is out of control, like trying to be swept away by the current. knowing that you have to fight, but knowing that you can't. The pull is too strong. That's when it happened. He kissed me. And at that moment, everything collapsed. It wasn't a long kiss. And it wasn't even particularly passionate. It was more like the kind of kiss you give when you're not really sure it's the right thing to do, but you do it anyway. As soon as our lips touched, the blow of reality hit me like a ton of bricks. I went away. My heart was pounding, and I could see the same shock growing in my chest on his face. It was a mistake, a huge mistake. I didn't say a word. I stood there while my mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. He looked at me with an expression, as if he was trying to figure out what to say, but we both knew there was no turning back now. The cue was over. Bin crossed. I told him that we couldn't do that it wasn't supposed to happen, but my voice wasn't even convincing to my own ears. He nodded, but the damage was already done. We both knew that. I left that day, and I haven't seen him since. I look back now and realize how out of control things can get. It started as something as harmless as a conversation, a little connection, and it turned into something so much bigger than I expected. I really don't know what I was thinking. Maybe I didn't think at all. But the truth is, once that line is crossed, it changes everything. You cannot undo it. He can't go back to the way things were before. I know that from experience, and I'm not proud of what happened, knowing that I have to live with it. But in the end, I can only hope that I have learned something from this, something that will prevent me from making the same mistake again. Because trust me, once you cross that line, it's a place you never want to go back.